weren't able to join but would like to watch it. So we have a number of our past webinars on YouTube, and again, you can search YouTube for NCSR and those will come up. Joan.
Okay. Yes.
We can hear you. We can see you.
And can you see the presentation?
Yes, we
More
can.
importantly.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, I'll get started then. Thank you very much, Duncan, for the invite, and just for, I suppose, for the work to date on NCSR, which has been excellent, and I'll use it within my presentation as well, some of the really good information and best practice that we've learned. So I'm just going to speak for about 20 minutes or so and then hand over to Andy to look at kind of the whole leadership area of community resilience, but I'm going to look at it really, I suppose, from a regional, and that's a Northern Ireland perspective, and then also a local perspective. So really looking at how we're trying to embed our strategic and local arrangements as collaboratively as possible. So my views are, I suppose, from a personal perspective as well as a professional perspective, and it's as my role as the regional officer. So I suppose in UK terms, that's really providing the project programme secretariat for the 3 emergency preparedness groups in Northern Ireland, which would be the equivalent to LRFs in England, and an overarching Northern Ireland emergency preparedness group as well. I'm also the joint chair of a regional group called the Regional Community Resilience Group, which I'll talk about within the presentation, and also a board member of NCSR. So I think you'll see throughout the presentation I've taken information from a variety of resources, particularly, I suppose, learning from COVID, which has been, I suppose, every cloud has a silver lining, but certainly it really has brought the issue of community resilience and how do we actually do this with communities and taking communities with us really to the fore, and also some good research even from the likes of Storm Arwen and Red Cross as well. So aim of presentation, really just looking at my vision, I suppose, is that societal resilience is achievable. As I said, COVID really revealed a tremendous capacity and the tremendous capacity and the knowledge that our communities have, and it really raised that importance. But we know that we can't do it, government can't do it, community and voluntary sector can't do it by themselves. We have to work collaboratively to do that. We need to move away from a transactional relationship more to a shared understanding of what is required to develop, to sustain and to nurture resilience in our communities. And I come back to those 3 words about development, sustaining and nurturing, because really that is, I suppose, the milestones that we need to be attaining to have that sustained resilience across our communities. And we only can do this really by placing people at the heart of our structures, of our plans, of our responses, of our coordination structures. And that's what we're trying to do here in Northern Ireland. And by doing that, I suppose the outcomes will be that our communities will feel safer, they'll feel more confident because they'll know what risks and what they actually can be empowered to do as part of that overarching multi-agency response, and protected even if there is a crisis or an emergency in their area. I suppose to do that, we have to recognise that people are very diverse, they have lots of different needs, and we need to do it in a way that we don't leave anyone behind. So thinking about resilience and what whole society resilience and societal resilience actually means, and all the different buzzwords that we've probably heard, is particularly, I suppose, over this since we've joined NCSR and started to look out. And I suppose some of the words that I think are really relevant is adaptation, collaboration, communication, empowering ourselves as statutory organisations, but also empowering our communities, co-design, harnessing and flexibility. And that's really, I think, captures what we're trying to do here. So it is complex, and certainly I use the phrase about this VUCA environment. You're a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment that we lead in, and that comes back from a leadership theory from 1987. And certainly since 1987, there's been huge changes on a global stage. So how relatable that volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environment that we live in, and how relatable that is just to achieving societal resilience. And it is complex. You know, there's so many different community arrangements. There's so many different levels of cohesion in communities, and certainly here in Northern Ireland, ethnicity, social and political factors and demographics. And we also have, you know, the only land border here as well in the UK. So all those types of things and machinations do really make a difference to how we do achieve community resilience. So I hope this presentation will highlight that if the willingness to drive it is from a strategic level, which I think we have captured here and really harnessed in Northern Ireland, then the sky is the limit for achieving societal resilience. So just to take you through, I suppose, the current arrangements in Northern Ireland, just to give you a bit of context. So, as I said, we have 3 emergency preparedness groups across our 11 council areas in Northern Ireland, and those will be relatively similar to LRFs, so local resilience forums, in the rest of the UK or in England, and LRPs and in Scotland, and our major emergency management groups in the south of Ireland. But we are lucky in Northern Ireland. We have a small geography. We've only 1 police force, we've only 1 fire service and 1 ambulance service. And whilst we do have 11 councils, they are autonomous entities, whilst they do work collectively on a range of various issues, one being civil contingencies, which we actually are hosted by 1 council, but actually have a Northern Ireland remit, which just changed prior to COVID. And it's been so beneficial for shared learning, for consistency, and just for having that strategic insight with our chief executives. So you'll see in the middle diagram our structures. We have very tight governance structures from operational to tactical strategic level. In Northern Ireland, we have subgroups under EPGs. We have a cross-border emergency management group because emergencies don't ignore borders and don't respect borders. And we've certainly seen that with COVID. We have, as I will talk about in a few minutes, about the Regional Community Resilience Group. And then we have our overarching strategic governance group, which is called the Civil Contingencies Group for Northern Ireland. And that would link then across to COBRA and the UK arrangements, and also the Republic of Ireland arrangements. We also have an overarching Northern Ireland Civil Contingencies Framework, which was published in August 2021. And it has been a great change and welcome and bolster to civil contingencies at a tactical level. Even the title of it, Building Resilience Together, you know, just makes the whole concept and the principles of working together embedded and enshrined from the top level. And that's very much built on the pillars of prepare, respond, and recover. So, believe it or not, we actually, in June of this year, Northern Ireland published their first bespoke civil contingencies risk register, which outlined 44 different risks, very much based on the national security risk assessment, but for the first time actually was very much embedded for Northern Ireland. It's divided into thematic areas, so environmental, human, animal health and food security, major accidents and incidents, economical, supply chain and societal risks, and malicious attacks. So this really has provided a fabulous platform and a really key building block to begin our work on the development of a community risk register, which we have never had before in Northern Ireland. And we are using that then as our kind of platform to work with our communities and begin the wider development of community response or resilience plans with our communities. So we also have a Northern Ireland, just again provide a bit of context, a Northern Ireland Civil Contingencies Resilience Strategy. And it was just published prior to COVID, and we're actually doing a midpoint review of that strategy at the minute. But I just want to highlight, even prior to COVID, our strategic priority number 1 was to enhance public preparedness. And that really, our objectives were really about warning and informing, promoting resilience at all levels, at individual, homes, businesses, communities, educational, public awareness, and then also working with all our sectors across government, our statutories, but also our community and voluntary sector. So how are we doing? How are we engaging with the public at the minute currently? So I alluded to the Regional Community Resilience Group, which has representation from the organisations to the right of your slide. So a lot of organisations represented at that group. However, the focus from 2013, when that was established, and the inception of that group was very much looking at severe weather and looking at severe risks, areas that are at risk to flooding, and you'll see that from the membership of the group. So we have 30 different areas of community resilience areas across Northern Ireland, and we've worked with a lot of partners, as you can see from the slide. And it's worked very well, and I'll give you a case study in a second about how that has worked. But we do recognise that this has to be wider, it has to be holistic, and flooding just doesn't happen in isolation. There's lots of other factors, but it does get you, I suppose, that inroads into communities. But by our experience of building those community resilience areas and sustaining and developing those, that has been a really good pathway and a good evidence base about what we want to take forward and widening the scope of our resilience groups. So how are we engaging with public? So I just thought it would be useful just to give a very short video that's subtitled, so hopefully everyone can hear it, just about the reason why we have our community resilience areas in Northern Ireland.
Climate change is altering the familiar weather patterns that we've been used to for many generations. Just this year, Northern Ireland has broken its high maximum temperature record, which has stood for almost half a century. That record fell 3 times in a week. We've witnessed extreme rainfall events which have caused damage to property, damage to our infrastructure, and on 1 or 2 occasions brought a significant risk to life. New extremes are becoming the norm. Extremes of temperature, extremes of rainfall are challenging our communities. We need to be prepared.
So John Wiley's on our community resilience, regional community resilience group, and that's really our opener for our communities about how do we work with yourselves to be prepared. So just to give an idea of what actually we were doing, I suppose pre-2020 with our community groups. We were going out to communities. A lot of communities probably are very angry about some of the risks that they felt with regards to severe weather. But we developed household emergency plans and community emergency plans. We connected people to Met Office alerts. We provide phone calls with community champions and leaders from relevant lead government departments about forthcoming weather events. We work with communities to understand pressure points in their local areas in relation to flooding. And we've also helped them to locate sandbag containers and very simple equipment, but actually really useful equipment if there is flooding. So it's not at all about statutory organisations shirking away from their responsibilities, but empowering people to help themselves and their neighbours. They know where they go to if they're evacuated. They have cascade trees within their community plans. So 1 resident would inform 3 residents, etc., etc. They know who the vulnerable people are in their communities, and they help those and prioritise those first without the need to ask, but very much doing it in a joint effort with their coordination arrangements. So I just want to look at what actually that looks like, and then how we've built on that and try to widen that out. So thinking about suppose some flooding that we experienced in 2017 in the Northwest, and actually in the Republic of Ireland as well, where in the Northwest there's over 700 properties flooded. And we began working with, and we'd actually already started some work with a community just outside Derry in Strabane, and we were very lucky that we had a very good community group and a very great community activists within that area. And I'm sure Andy will talk about how really important that leadership is within communities. We work with communities, and the initial stage were not easy. You know, people were saying, like, you know, you're coming to us after we're flooded. What actually can you do? We need hard engineering. So it was very much relationship building and actually developing trust between partners and the voluntary sector and the communities. But we all did from the outset highlight our commitment from the statutories, from the voluntary and community sector to sustain and to work with the community on a long-term basis. We weren't going to walk away, and I think that's really important that we do have that nurturing and sustainability. And so all those types of plans that I talked about earlier were developed. So this year we had very similar flooding on the 23rd of July, a medium impact warning of rain, very, very short notice of a very heavy convective rain And the community were linked in from the outset. They got their text messages, they got calls from early government department. So they were really in response mode. They liaised throughout with our multi-agency coordination piece. They helped to, they opened up their sandbag containers to help to protect the most vulnerable areas. They helped neighbours put on individual flood protection that was provided in their homes. They warned and informed, and really they provided the ground truth to us as a multi-agency coordination about what actually was happening on the ground. So they were instantaneous, spontaneous volunteers. And they saved lots of homes due to that community engagement, cohesion and response. And they were also embedded in a recovery phase. Their voice was heard loud and clear about what actually their priorities were in recovery, and they will be involved in our debriefing process as well. So I think that does show, if you bring the communities with you, you engage with them throughout, prepare, respond and recovery, but you also have that dialogue of trust built that really does make a difference. So what are our next steps? So as you'll see from our slides, we're very much focused on that flooding and severe weather. So we had began to engage with Duncan and Andrew and rushing through the National Consortium of Societal Resilience probably early last year, and really just, we're kind of blown away by the breadth of knowledge, the great practice, the great other areas of the world, not just the UK, that we're doing and trying to develop community resilience and whole society resilience within their very, very unique communities, and Northern Ireland being a very unique community in itself. So that has been a real game changer for ourselves. We've had the development of our regional community, or we're at the process of developing our first community risk register for Northern Ireland. And again, something that we really want to use as a platform to assist engagement. And then we're taking forward 2 pilots in Northern Ireland to widen that scope for community resilience. So, and we've entitled them Prepare, Adapt and Strengthen. But we, as I said earlier on, we can't do this by ourselves. And parallel to this, we're strengthening our relationships with our policing community safety partnerships, our community planning colleagues, our community development colleagues, our community and voluntary sector, faith community, business community, and also our cross-border links. So that has been a really important reaching out to our partners to say, we can't do this by ourselves. These are doing lots of things as well that are actually very much about community engagement, community empowerment. We can, by doing this together, we can add value, and we're not duplicating. So so basically we know that community resilience is that sustainability for communities to effectively employ the resources and the expertise that they have in their own communities, and by fostering that really strong sense of community resilience, this will in turn allow for adaptation and growth of a community after in the aftermath of an incident. And we've seen that in various areas where maybe cohesion in communities wasn't very strong, but actually after something did happen, or after they understood maybe risks in their area, they really came together and were really keen, of course, to protect their homes in their own areas. So they want to work with us to identify what the local needs are to help to reduce vulnerabilities and to implement any mitigation measures that can be put in place. So the way we're doing this is through vulnerabilities and capacities assessment. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's very much, and we use that in the outset of our methodology for our working with our 30 community resilience areas in Northern Ireland. It's, I suppose, originally came from the British Red Cross or the International Red Cross, and it's really a participatory process developed for communities to become more resilient. And I'll talk about it in a second, but I'll not go through the whole slide here, but really it's about inclusive participation, about community leadership and empowerment. It's looking at local perspectives. It gives communities a better, they understand what the extent of existing and changing emerging risks that they have and they will be facing. So we're very much linked into our climate NI colleagues as well in Northern Ireland, and what practical steps that they can take, and then also about the whole mobilisation of resources as well. So it's so important that communities own these plans, and that they feel that we are not imposing onto them or taking the lead. It's very much about working with those communities to co-design and to co-create these plans themselves and these arrangements themselves. So what are the strategic drivers for change? And I alluded to that we need to have that top level commitment from government. We have a draft programme for government here, and you know, every single outcome or outcome-based accountability, but nearly every single outcome really we can actually cross-reference with enhancing and building societal resilience. So you know, it's really embedded into every part of government and within our draft community plan. And I talked earlier on about that need to strengthen relationships both at local and also at regional level. So I suppose other things that we've been how to wrap around our community resilience, we do have like a getting weather ready easing, and we're looking at broadening that out, so that's not just weather ready, it's being ready for any type of civil emergency, and that will be done in parallel with the development of our community risk register. We are working with two councils, well hopefully two councils. One council is definitely Derry City and Strabane District Council, and again a really useful a pilot because it has a cross-border dimension. It has Lough Foyle. It's experienced lots of different severe weather emergencies. It has coma sites, so, and it's also got the urban and rural dimension as well, and it's to the west of Northern Ireland, so not really you know, that Belfast based as well. So it's a really good example, I think, for taking forward a pilot, and hopefully we have another council with coastal and a different demographic as well coming on board. So that's, I think, that slide, and then just close to finish. So what are our challenges and opportunities? So I talked earlier on about our three words: or develop, sustain, and grow. Develop, sustain, and nurture. And we only can do that if we're resourced. And unfortunately, we're on a 1-year funding from our department, or similar to DLUC across in England, and that's just because of our political situation here in Northern Ireland. But it's very hard to plan on a long-term basis if you're on a year-on-year funding mechanism. And we also need that whole of government approach. I said earlier on, our programme for government is a draft programme for government. We really need to be working across all of the government departments, because every part of that machinery has an element to play, and by doing it together, it's such a synergistic impact if we have that whole of government approach. So opportunities, as I said, look, we're part of NCSR. We've found it really useful. We've been involved in the workshop and developed, and our methodology for our pilots has really grown from the workshops that we've been involved in with the consortium. We have strategic champions, and I think that'll lead on very well to what Andy's going to talk about that leadership piece. And that is, you know, so important that we're a regional structure here in Northern Ireland. We have, you know, one of our chief executives from the councils that is a lead officer for civil contingencies, and then also just thinking about the resilience, the draft resilience strategy from the UK, and that UK policy, which is so much more focused on community resilience now. So I'll end with just a little short video from our Chief Executive from Newry Morning Down, who is our civil contingencies lead for Northern Ireland, and that's just really, you know, illustrating that we have got that strategic buy-in. And I suppose now it's really time to act and to work with our partners to deliver this. But again, using I suppose what we've learned from NCSR as well.
In developing a more resilient society, it is important to fully understand the challenges of preparing to mitigate against unknown future crises. The response to COVID-19 demonstrated the willingness and capacity of communities to work together to help each other. We can build on that and strengthen existing community resilience structures using approaches that we know work, as evidenced by the RCRG methodology. To be successful in this, we must continue to work with communities to help them plan and adapt to long-term changes, like the greater frequency of severe weather as an effect of climate change. Co-design and co-production is at the heart of RCRG's methodology, helping communities maintain a greater sense of control and confidence. No single organisation or department can effectively meet the needs of a community in an emergency, so the multi-agency approach to community resilience, as embraced by RCRG, is essential. It is important that we now work to maintain our current groups and encourage the establishment of others, and work to widen the scope and build on a more holistic approach that was so evident in our communities during the pandemic across Northern Ireland.
Okay, so that's all from me. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope you found that useful, and I suppose a practical example of some of the challenges and opportunities that we are facing. So I think I'm handing over to Andy now, so I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Andy.
Thanks, Joan. Nice to see you all this afternoon. I'm Andy Ferrier. I'm Chief Executive of Test Valley Borough Council, and I know that most people don't have a clue where Test Valley is. It isn't in the north of England. I am a Yorkshireman, and when I got this job, I had a lot of friends saying how nice it was I was moving back to the Tees Valley. It's not. It's actually western side of Hampshire. It's got one of the finest chalk streams in the world. Not many people knew that, but thankfully Bob Mortimer and Paul Whitehouse have based themselves in Test Valley now to do their fishing trips, and so more people are hearing about it. I guess that one of the things that it's worth saying before I give my very hyper-local presentation is that Test Valley isn't a place, and that's quite important to reflect on, because a number of my observations will be based on that. In fact, there's a little interesting anecdote about the history of Test Valley and why it exists. I understand that back in 1973, we weren't going to actually have an organisation called Test Valley, but that in the south of our borough, Earl Mountbatten of Burma had his seat, and that there was a proposal to put his seat in with Southampton, and he bloody well wasn't going to have that. So he came up with a suggestion for Test Valley. So it is an amalgam of very different communities that kind of loosely share this chalk stream, but there isn't a lot of connectivity between them. And just to add to the presentation today, I have got a councillor colleague on the line, a guy called Councillor Phil Lashbrook. He's chairman of the Local Resilience Forum in our part, which is a community-based forum. And again, I think he will bring a different perspective to that community view, should you wish to ask him some questions as we go through this. So just to start, the context for this is kind of hyper-local, but there'll be some observations about our kind of leadership behaviours as a group. And these observations are not from the perspective of a community resilience specialist, and certainly not an emergency planning specialist. As the chief executive, it isn't my background. And what I would say is that it has been mostly around watching and observing how good community resilience has come about. And a lot of that is really based on serendipity, things happening, people trying things out, but there's never been a grand plan as such. It has been very much about conditions coming about to create certain things, and certain things have happened as a result of that. And part of that is that we've got an incredibly active set of communities in this area around community resilience. And what I've been trying to do is to unpick why that happened. And one of the things that I'll be able to share with you in the next few months is a report that was commissioned by our local LRF, which I had a hand in writing, but has been done by an independent body called the Southern Policy Centre. And that is something we'll be able to share with you. And that report is very much focused on working with communities themselves to try and find out what the magic ingredients are about high levels of involvement in community resilience. So my observations actually don't come from a community resilience perspective at all. They start from a community development and perhaps a local democratic perspective. When I arrived in this organisation, bearing in mind the things I'd said about it doesn't necessarily feel like a place, it was very disengaged from the communities that form its parts, and in some ways was partly linked to the fact that it was a very traditional organisation, very centralised, and it didn't have that sense of an organisation that might help develop its communities. We were acutely worried about this, and so what we did was we entered into a year-long partnership with the National Local Government Association to see whether or not, as an independent arbiter, they could start to bring into play for us some of the important building blocks that might make us more of an enabler in our communities, and help us understand what that might look like. Interestingly, what came to the fore was that the place-based convener of of local communities wasn't something that the local authority per se or any other statutory organisation was particularly good at. It often brought its own perspectives, its own angles, its own priorities, and that was immediately a turn-off for local people. But what the Local Government Association really did hone in on was the legitimacy of locally elected people in conveners of place conversations. And that, in a sense, some of the people that had been at the forefront of conversations with communities in the past had been people like me, officials of organisations who hadn't necessarily grown up in the place, but wanted particularly to drive an agenda home on behalf of their organisations. So we started to develop a model which was essentially around place and democratic leadership. And that, in a way, recognised that sense that our communities were all very different and that they didn't fit into our blueprint of doing things. And in that model, people like locally elected councillors started to approach things differently. And in part that was around their own skills, rather than necessarily taking on heroic leadership roles, starting to build networks, to facilitate, to get beyond the old suspects that perhaps were the most key people in those communities. And what we did as a kind of a quid pro quo to that was start to devolve things to those people. We started to devolve the ability to convene. We provided opportunities for financial support locally, and also, probably more importantly, opportunities, if these things have been done in a holistic way, for access to larger pots of money through things like New Homes Bonus and Community Infrastructure Levy. So this model, this acceptance that things happen differently in different areas, has enabled us over a period of about 10 years to allow many communities to flourish, but in a way that's led by them as opposed to us as the local authority. So we've got key people in that mix, such as our elected councillors and people supporting them, but it isn't an agenda that's driven by us. What we have done is provided the assets and allow them to identify what their needs are and how they can best provide them. So that's a kind of a community development context to where I'm coming from. Other reflections really go back to things like the floods that we all had in the UK in 2014, and some of the things that we learned from that. Again, many of you will have enacted your normal emergency planning arrangements, as we did, and it was an excellent response. We were fortunate through the LRF to get military support. I'm fortunate in this organisation that I've got a number of directly employed people that we could pull off frontline services to help with all of the classic sandbagging and making sure that communities were safe. But it was the sense that something else was happening at that point in time for us, and that after the events, community leaders in a way forced the statutory organisations, the blue light services, to the table to start to examine what had happened and why in some communities the response had been so positive. And that it was apparent that a number of our communities that were flooded didn't need our help. And again, it was no surprise to us, and it was no surprise to you, that they were the people that had community resilience plans in place, and that they were able to effectively mobilise local people, look after their vulnerable people, make sure that the local generators were working, they had the sandbag stocks, etc. And it worked particularly well. But I guess that the real surprise for us was that how did those things come about, and how had they come into play originally? And when we did the studies of what success had looked like, it kept going back to very local community leaders, often in the form of an elected representative, who would use their convening power, in part because they'd got local resource which they had a delegation to use, and that lack of a kind of a centralised approach had somehow provided something quite powerful. And those local people forced us, and I say forced us because it wasn't necessarily a natural instinct, to bring them all together, to have a reflection on what had gone well during those particular floods. And predominantly the reflections were that people at the most local of levels have been given the tools to get on with it, and they've not had people like me sticking their oar in. It was as simple as that. Now, when we brought them together, there was an awful lot of storytelling being told, as you can imagine. And what was really apparent was that after years of people like myself and the Blue Light Services talking to local organisations about the real importance of community resilience and not a lot happening, was that the impact of the local storytelling and the impact of people who were just like them talking about how powerful they'd been in this particular situation mobilised people in a way that I'd never seen before. And a really strong and a network that's still established today came about because of that. And we've gone now through several years, 8 or 9 years or more, of essentially a peer learning workshop where people come together and talk actively about the things that they've done in their local community, how they could support each other, and how together they could do things that really make an impact. And that contrasts with perhaps the approach that we used to take, where people would rock up at particular community forums and tell people how they should run community resilience. So quite a lot of learning there for us in terms of our style and how we work. And a number of byproducts from that as well is that it has started to personalise the relationships between organisations, and it started to build levels of trust that we didn't see before. This is because the chief inspector is no longer the representative of the police. He's just another guy who works with the community groups. Similarly with the fire and rescue people, they're no longer representatives of an organisation. They're there, they're people that are known within those communities, and they're people who can help make these communities more resilient. And I guess the interesting thing about it is that it's a reflection on leadership and how leadership behaviours perhaps in this grey area of working within community settings perhaps needs to change. We've reflected on what happened prior to this number of events coming together and how behaviours from organisations such as myself had affected the interaction. But in working together, we were seeing people from Blue Light Services through the voluntary sector, through to organisations such as myself, developing a sense of respect and trust amongst colleagues from community organisations, where we were facilitating those conversations rather than necessarily leading those conversations. And that everything that we did has started to happen in a co-produced way, something that we would not have instinctively done before. So quite a lot in there, just a reflection from a colleague of mine who's former chief executive of Redbridge, something he says about leadership, which is quite connected to what I've just been saying. He says, as we go forward, leadership is now about creating the spaces, the time, the support and the encouragement for the right people in the right organisations and in the community to find the right solutions. So I guess my first lesson, in a sense, and reflection on community resilience is the approach that we need to take, and perhaps the behaviours that we need to change if we are to work in communities and alongside communities. So moving on a little bit and into some sort of wider reflections. Ian Holt, who some of you may know, he was a larger-than-life emergency planning lead for Hampshire County Council down in these parts. He did come along to one of the sessions that was organised by the community representatives, who were by this time starting to get interested in the bigger picture. And Ian was asked to give a presentation on how their very localised activities linked to the national scene. And Ian, being Ian, told them what the largest risks were for the country as a whole, and top of his list, as you will have known, was the idea of a worldwide pandemic. And how did the community representatives laugh at that? The thought that they might in some way be able to respond to a worldwide pandemic was something that they thought was quite laughable. But roll on a few years, and of course, I'm sure many of you have had similar reflections. The network that responded to flooding responded magnificently to the COVID pandemic. And again, just in the same way as they did in the floods, they took massive pressure off blue light organisations, the public sector organisations in this area. because a number of those things, the self-help concept, the idea of looking after people in the communities the most vulnerable, was something that was critical to that particular exercise. I was with a group of chief executives recently, and one of the chief executives said that she was so pleased that her organisation was able to move staff from the frontline services to deliver food during the COVID pandemic. I was most proud that I didn't have to do that, because the community groups in our area did most of it for us. So as I come to some final conclusions, there is some structure behind this, and there will be a report, as I say, that we'll share with you in the next few months. Post the pandemic, Neil Odin, the Chief Fire Officer for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, asked me to do a little bit of work with partners around what makes good community resilience, and what, in a sense, are the nudges that would get people working alongside us in community settings. So we've undertaken that work over the last 12 months with an organisation, as I say, called the Southern Policy Centre. They're a think tank led by former Government Minister John Denham and supported by a guy called Simon Eden, who's a former local authority chief executive. And they've been working with a variety of different groups across the piece to try and capture what some of the main ingredients are about what makes communities engage in that community resilience piece. Some of the kind of the top line findings before I finally shut up are that, for example, community resilience and participation in community resilience is usually an indicator of something else. And I think the reflections are particularly about where a number of public bodies have invested in the assets of that community, be it the people, be it the facilities, that are way before we ask them to get engaged in community resilience. The idea that a one-size-fits-all approach to community resilience that doesn't take into account local circumstances is likely to be perceived as being top-down, and there is a good chance it may fail. And again, this is the voice of local people, some of them who are involved in community resilience, and some of them are people who are not, but we wanted to see whether they would be involved in it in future. And some of the examples they cited of a very top-down approach would be, and it's the classic, the NHS volunteer programme that was put in place during COVID. Again, that sense that the government didn't understand that local communities have strong networks and that those networks will do things. The idea of an institution coming in from on high and introducing another network, and the damage that they can have. And also other things that we've heard from the most local of groups is the idea of the voluntary sector not just being one big thing. So when we hear about the importance of voluntary organisations in community resilience, local communities perceive voluntary organisations at very different levels. There's organisations that operate at sub-national level, national level, and there's voluntary organisations that operate at the hyper-local. And there is a suspicion when a local authority or an LRF goes into partnership with a more regionally based voluntary sector organisation and parachutes them into a local community setting, that is perceived in some ways by the groups we spoke to as just being like a public sector organisation coming in and operating in a very centralised way. So one of the main recommendations from the report is around the way in which the statutory sector can seek to adapt to work in different and local circumstances, and to acknowledge that in different parts of your communities there are different assets at play. And for example, we went across to the Isle of Wight and did some work with the community groups there. It was apparent that their local voluntary services, Council for Local Voluntary Services, had played an absolutely crucial role in the coordination of their COVID efforts, and that without that effort, it would have not worked in the same way. But we saw equally in other communities that it was the local faith group that played that coordination group, or it was a veterans group, or it was a local charity, or it was a town or parish council. But what was important about that was that where the LRF or the local authority concerned engaged with them, they accepted their legitimacy and accepted that what they needed was the local authority support and not control necessarily. So the kind of concluding remark from me is that as people involved in LRFs and various public organisations, that one of the reflections is around the idea that community development can help local resilience. Now, community development can be many, many years in the making, but it does, in a sense, build up stronger foundations for the longer term. And I guess if I was to be critical of us as a sector, it's time that we started to do some leadership work together about the way we behave and act in communities. And I do think that people like HIFETS and their work on systems leadership have some things for us to reflect on as we go forward. So my final remark is that it isn't all about community resilience. Communities don't get out of bed in the morning and they think, you know what, I'm going to put myself together a lovely community resilience plan. But they do get out of bed in the morning and live in that community and think about what good outcomes might be for them. That's it from me, thanks. And I'm sure, like Joan, would be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you very much, Joan, for great presentations. As Duncan mentioned at the very beginning, I'll be taking you through the Q&A session. Obviously, people can still place their questions using the chat function, but otherwise people can perhaps raise their hands and I can try to get through everyone in the order that you raise them. I do have a question already for Joan in the chat, which is really relating to the resilience areas that you mentioned, Joan, and this is from Victoria, where she's asking about the 30 resilience areas and whether that means there are 30 community resilience plans.
Yeah, so thanks, Andrew. Yes, so there are 30 community resilience plans in those areas, and again, you know, very much developed by the community, but linked into then our multi-agency structures. So very much. I suppose that's why we're looking at widening out that. So they're very much focused on severe weather. So we're looking at through our pilot then trying to widen that out and develop planning arrangements and structures. And I think Andy kind of hit it on the head there. Like, it's not just about the plans, it's actually how we nurture communities, that's in their thinking and in their process of actually how they are involved in communities. So 30 plans.
And I see also from Duncan, and this is Joan also mentioned in relation to debriefing communities and how this can be done effectively and what happens to the lessons that sort of demonstrates that they have been listened to and that actions are subsequently taken. I think that's a question obviously that both Joan and Andy can reflect upon. So okay. Andy, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, I think the sense of it being a holistic process is really important, and that some of the things I was saying there was that something would happen and it wouldn't be a kind of a blue light reflection on what happened or a public sector local authority reflection. It was a reflection in a single place with all of those people involved in that, understanding what the response was. And I'm guessing that at Joan's level, it's probably not quite as easy to do that in the way that I can, because we can bring very, very hyper local groups together alongside the blue light services to do that. But it does send out a really strong message that we're equal partners in this and that we have different roles to play. And in my situation, I know that what's happened is that the local community groups have grown to value the role of the LRF in particular, and that they understand now that by being part of a larger network, that does allow the ability to bring in extra resource when they're in serious need. So I think that shows a shared understanding of different roles, but kind of being equal, we're just different, is really important in terms of the community resilience piece.
I'll just come back and then about the debriefing piece. So look, when you think about it, it's ridiculous not to have communities involved in the debriefing, because I mean it's the communities that are actually being impacted. So we have actually written into the new Building Resilience Together framework about how we debrief. So we would do an organisational debrief, a GESIP debrief, and then a multi-agency debrief, and there's kind of recommended timelines for that. So when we get to the multi-agency debrief, it's very much about the impacts on the community, on businesses, etc. And it's so important that they are around the table, and we did it in 2017, and it wasn't very comfortable. I mean, it can be frustrating, both for communities and for ourselves, but it's also very enlightening. And I think by doing that, and it's back to this dialogue of trust, by doing that, when that flooding happened again this summer, those people that were impacted understood the pressures that individual organisations were under. They understood the structures. So they were, when we have had some elected members debrief meetings or committee meetings, and we actually, there wasn't that anger, that palpable anger that was really evident in 2017. So we really need to be engaging with communities throughout those three pillars: prepare, respond and recover.
Thank you, Joan. So there are a number of things perhaps for Andy. Andy, you mentioned, I think, a community person that you also had on the line. And it might be interesting to hear their perspective, but that then possibly also relates to another question that's come into the chat in relation to the role of elected members. Well, it's framed as help or hindrance, but obviously you might like to frame it in a different way. But just your experience in terms of that, in terms of working, with the community and resilience work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good framing of the question, to be honest. I mean, I've worked for several local authorities across the UK, and I have to say that in some areas, the elected members have been a hindrance. And I think that what has been helpful about the process that we've gone through over a period of probably the best part of a decade here, it has been a cultural change process, really, where the elected members have moved from a mindset of I'm elected, so therefore I know, and I'm going to do the resource planning for my community, to a position where members culturally now say I've been elected to represent my organisations, to represent my communities and understand them in greater detail. And my primary purpose is one of convener, and to be able to enhance and harness the energies of that community. So they've become, in a sense, like an extension of the community development model. And that requires hard work, and it requires leadership from politicians at the most senior of levels to describe the role in different terms, and to set a framework around it, which is about development as well. So it doesn't happen by chance, it happens because those members take their own development really seriously. And they obviously take the whole idea of being able to harness their community's energies really seriously. Some of it is about carrot and stick as well, because if those members are able to do things like proper community planning processes where they prove and evidence the need, not just talking to those people that they would normally hear at the end of the bar, big things come from that in our area. They get access to much larger levels of resource, and that means that they can provide more in their communities. So there is a sense of a two-pronged attack from our perspective, which is that communities who are not getting that will start to say to their elected member, you need to start to behave and act in this way. And the guy on the line is a chap called Councillor Phil Lashbrook, I think somewhere in the mass of names. And Phil's interesting because he's been a convener of very local resilience groups and has proved the power of community. And as a result of that, he's a very humble chap, as being, in a sense, asked to convene this wider peer learning group in our area, which he does very effectively because he's so authentic and is so knowledgeable through the experience of his communities.
That's great. Thank you, Andy. Joan, it's really just to relay the similar question in terms of your experiences. Obviously, you mentioned being embedded within a council, albeit having a regional remit. So what would be your experiences in terms of elected members and their engagement in resilience building?
Well, I think they're vital, and I think they have to be included. We work very closely with our Northern Ireland Local Government Association, and we actually have trained an annual training programme with our elected members. So we go through like scenarios, but also about what the roles and responsibilities of councillors are and elected members, and to make sure that again they understand how the multi-agency coordination works, but also, you know, their role within that. And actually, I feel that the elected members in Northern Ireland, they're very engaged with their communities, and have been a real advocate for civil contingencies and community resilience. But we also mustn't forget about, you know, community activists and community leaders that maybe aren't attached to you know, political structures, and you know, those are very important as well. But again, that's back to having the right links in your communities and knowing who the right people are to talk to. And again, that only comes with developing those kind of grassroots relationships. They may be elected members, or they may be a community advocate.
Thank you, Joan. We've also a question in relation to the research that Andy mentioned, and I wonder, Sasha Taylor, if you're amenable, if you might want to come on video and ask the question. Otherwise, I can relay it to Andy, which is in relation to the research that that you mentioned, that the report will be emerging in the next couple of months. I don't see Sasha. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Sasha, go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you, Andy. The question I had was, I'm really interested. I'm from the Kent Resilience Forum. I work in the Kent Resilience team as Communications and Engagement Officer. I'm really interested in the work that that's been commissioned by Hampshire and Isle of Wight with Southern Policy Centre. I think it looks like really important work. You know, what the findings will be about what makes people work within people within communities engage with community resilience work. It's something that we're looking to explore in Kent, and you know, sort of creating something around a sort of benchmark on that. You know, what people's awarenesses are of risks and of the drivers to lead them to be interested in co-developing their own community resilience. So I was, you know, it was more, I don't know whether this is too much of a specific question for this forum, but I was quite interested in the methodology for this research, and a little bit more about sort of some of the rationales and some of those questions that you're asking.
Yeah, can I take that, Andrew? Thanks, Sasha. That's a really good question. The reason why it isn't published yet is that we've got to take it back to the Hampshire and Isle of Wight LRF in November. The Southern Policy Centre are going to take that through, and the whole premise of the research was one of a deliberative approach. We've got some interesting connections with government in this area through trying out deliberative democracy at the most local of levels, and the idea was to bring together people who are either involved in community resilience or community groups who weren't, and for them to understand what community resilience was, because I think that there was a sense that the language barrier is huge as well. If you are an LRF professional like you are, that to talk about community resilience to communities not engaged with, it was quite a big ask. So part of the Southern Policy Centre conversation was to help in the interpretation of that with community groups. So I wouldn't say that it was the most rigorous of methodology by any stretch of the imagination. It was a series of focus groups of people who were being asked really the question, now you understand what community resilience is, having heard some of these contributions, what do you think are some of the factors that might help you or your community take a more active part in that? And some of the comments that I've made really around its existing networks and such like were based on some of the things that came out of those conversations, i.e., you know, if you haven't got a community that is starting to build on its current assets, then the likelihood of it taking an active part in community resilience is probably really squat, and hence some of the things around our public bodies like our own actually prepared to invest in the greater good. in order to take that kind of sense that other things will come from it, such as greater participation in community resilience. But once we've taken this paper, it's not a massively long paper by any stretch of the imagination. Once we've taken that paper through the Hampshire and LRF in November, Laura Edwards, who was the lead, will publish it, I guess, amongst you guys.
And there was also not so much a question, but it might be interesting to hear from Robin Knox, who was talking about the particular experience of VCSEP. If Robin might like to sort of relay experience. And just before, Robin, I was interested, Andy, you mentioned obviously some of the deliberative kind of democracy type work, and also giving the local, hyper-local communities a budget. Was that kind of a participatory budget type approach?
Yeah, I mean, in part, I mean, we had some experience. We were one of 3 areas chosen nationally to do some work around deliberative democracy at most local levels, and we actually based some of it on work we've done around regeneration. And the idea was that if people understood, for example, things like the viability of regeneration projects and understood the perspectives of different people in that community, then they would better understand in a way how they might make things happen. But I think the most powerful thing about the process of deliberation for us was that it's become the antidote to social media, because we've seen kind of people who had quite polarized views coming together, because it is about having something that reflects the population as a whole, and move in position once they heard from that disabled person, for example, given their life experience. So it's quite a powerful force for good in my book, deliberative democracy as a process. And you know, I'd happily, if anybody's interested in how that works, talk about it. But the point of it really is around local people being informed before they give their views. And I think that that's an important part that's sometimes missed out of consultations. People are asked to talk about something and they don't necessarily know what it is, or they haven't got the time to properly input that. And I think the final point on it is that sometimes deliberative democracy is seen as a bit of a risk for representative democracy. I mean, our experience has been the opposite. What it's done is it's shown the appetite that communities have for change, which has often strengthened the arm of locally elected people, who often only hear from the people who are saying, no, we can't do that.
Apologies, Robin. Sorry, so go ahead.
Not at all. I mean, hi everybody, I'm Robin from the VCS Emergency Partnership, and I found it fascinating both listening to Joan and the you know, the read across from what we're hearing from our partners. It's just so similar, and it's so great to see more councils and also local resilience forums and equivalents sort of starting to work in this way. And I think that couple of points that I would just make, and I'm conscious I don't want to, you know, sort of violent agreement with you both rather than anything else, but I feel like there was one point in particular that Joan was making around the importance of that cross-pollination of groups, and I think Andy, you touched on this as well. But our partnership is made up of those hyper-local grassroots organisations, local infrastructure organisations, and sort of regional connectors through to your national or nationwide specialist VCS organisations. And the breadth and depth of that means that, you know, no 2 of those organisations are the same, and the way that they are, that people see the VCS as a homogenous thing can be quite tricky, and people become unstuck quite quickly there. And what I would say though is, and what we're finding is really encouraging, is the embracing of this network of networks approach, and recognising and seeing that as a strength rather than a challenge to overcome, and how you sort of work with connectors in the communities to expand reach and to get that breadth of voice into the work that we're doing. And one other point I wanted to make on when Joan was talking about the debriefing, I think what we tend to do, and this is the royal we, because I think we all do it in our own way, is that whether we're debriefing, planning, or even diagnosing the problem in the first instance, we tend to do that with our own first, and then slowly expand it out. And I think the more opportunities that we can do to bring the voice of a community group, the voice of a community connector, the voice of a specialist organisation that's centred on mental health, for example, as a consistent secondary impact of major emergencies, with council representatives, with national government together in you know, obviously you can't get everybody around every table every time, but constantly thinking about how we are understanding problems, would also then seek to address some of what Andy was talking about around elected representatives as well. If elected representatives are part of the conversation, not just with the other elected representatives, but with members of their community and with members of the decision makers within the statutory bodies as well, you start to get a real richness of that networked knowledge. And I think things like NCSR and the Emergencies Partnership that I'm leading are exactly the enablers of that. And the more that we can share this space, the better.
Thank you very much, Joan. First of all, and then perhaps Andy, whether you had any reflections based on Robin's contribution.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it can be difficult. And I think it was Andy had talked about, you know, some of the larger voluntary sectors and how, you know, that how to make sure that, you know, you aren't causing any conflict, I suppose, maybe it's too hard a word, at a local level with the bread and butter community and voluntary sector at that local level. So we have been engaged, and actually was one of our recommendations from the 2017 flooding about embedding the community and voluntary sector into prepare, respond and recover. I mean, COVID really changed our whole landscape for that. We have an emergency leadership group in Northern Ireland that's chaired through our Department for Communities, and they have all those interconnectors and that really richness and breadth across all the different parts of communities, like, you know, rural community support, rural networks, all the different voluntaries and third sector that, you know, it's not just regional organisations. So that has been really useful. There's still a lot of work to do, Robin, and I really would welcome a conversation with yourselves, because I know we are working hand in hand with DFC to progress this and try to get actually a chapter on community and voluntary sector in our urban resilience together framework. So that would be really useful just to progress and look at, you know, good practice across the UK. So yeah, look, happy to have a conversation offline, Robin, as well, about what we can maybe do a bit more collaboratively.
And Andrew, on that, I think Robin's spot on. My take on it is around, I'll start with the public sector organisations and our mindset, and that we should be embracing diversity in the sense of many different organisations from VCS networks contribute massively and positively to local incidents and the aftermath, and that we should be flexible enough to allow that to happen. I think that the work that you're doing around the connectivity between the regional and the hyper-local is really important as well, because it isn't only the public sector organisations that have a problem with creating the system and wanting everybody to work within that system. I think that it also is a problem, and local VCS colleagues will tell me that they also have as much problems working with each other sometimes. So if you're working in that broken environment, I think that's fantastic, and it would contribute massively to good outcomes on the ground.
Well, that's good. I'm conscious of time, but there are two questions in the chat, and Salafa, if you're willing to come on video and ask in relation to resourcing and upskilling of voluntary sector.
Yeah, I'm not that keen, so I'm just testing
okay.
for COVID, and I'm feeling terrible, so I'm a bit muggy. So if you wouldn't mind, that'd be great.
No, that's the problem. So Salafa's question is basically asking for both Joan and Andy's thoughts on resourcing and upskilling the voluntary sector, essentially to enable them to effectively get engaged with community resilience work and conversations. And partly relating to that then is the identification of target groups and how you go about that, and kind of what's the evidence base that's used in that sort of targeting.
Okay, Andrew, so I suppose to take just that evidence base and how we targeted the 30 areas, we did use criteria because it was quite easy to do that, because we're looking just at flooding. So we're looking at, you know, the flooding, the Department of Infrastructure's flooding maps, how many times we're flooded in previous years, even altitude and various factors like that. So that was quite easy to do, to identify those 30 areas, or, you know, areas across Northern Ireland. And actually it wasn't 30 at the start. Those other areas were then built on impacts or just word of mouth about actually that's a really good idea. We'd like to do that within our community. But the wider piece and our pilot hopefully will give us that evidence base about how actually you do this in a more targeted basis across Northern Ireland for that holistic community resilience. So that's hopefully part of our objectives from our agenda. So thinking about how do we upskill and work with communities or with the community and voluntary sector, we just back to what I spoke to about Robin, we're not doing that completely consistency across Northern Ireland. We aren't doing that with very hyper local. We do work very well with our national community or third sector community and voluntary sector, such as British Red Cross, and we do involve them in our training. They're part of our EPGs. We do have a regional community and faith group, but again, it is a work in progress, and a lot more work could be done and improvement made there.
Yeah, and Andrew, I suppose my reflection is really at the most local of levels. I think Joan's experiences are more strategic and broader than mine. The thing that I suppose it goes back to my presentation, really, it's around learning together. So we don't necessarily have training that's bespoke for the voluntary sector or the community sector, but what we do is we do very place-based exercises that involves communities, voluntary organisations, blue lights, and public bodies, and we laugh locally that one of our villages, we've blown it up, we've flooded it, we've poisoned it, we've probably had a nuclear bomb in there at one point in time. But actually, the kind of practical exercise shows the opportunities that there are for very local community groups and kind of larger voluntary groups to take part in that exercise and make a real difference when it comes to something happening on the ground at a local level.
That's fantastic. I think the final question I think may have been answered already within the chat, but just to relay it to you. So Duncan asked of Phil Lashbrook in terms of where do you start when you want to create a community group, and what did he need from local government and partners to do so? And I see that Phil has replied, yeah, first of all, confidence and trust in terms of building a relationship to develop a local group. And then the second key thing is teamwork at every level. So I'm not sure, Phil, if you want to come off, because I see you've just added some more to your answer, but whether you wanted to say that yourself rather than me reading it. And this would be the final contribution before I hand over to Duncan. Go ahead, Phil. Oh, I think you're off mute, but I'm not hearing anything. So the second aspect to the answer is suggesting that as far as local government partner support is concerned at bringing groups together, obviously teamwork is extremely important, and joint working at face-to-face level to deliver a message is also critically important as part of the team sharing the same objective. So I hope I've relayed that correctly, Phil. But I think that was a great Q&A session following two fantastic presentations, and I think I'll hand over now to Duncan to wrap up the session.
Sorry, Andrew, trying to do too many things with sharing screen simultaneously. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. And so you can hear me as well. There was so much in that, and you know, thank you to Andy, thank you to Joan for all of your thoughts and learning and insights. As I was listening to both, it was remarkable as to how much synergy there was across both of them, but also how it relayed into some of the work that we've been talking about in NCSR and through the strategy, through the manual that we've been developing. Thinking about I guess it's taking me into the place now of thinking about, right, how do we strengthen relationships? How do we build trust? How do we identify the style that works? How do we develop leaders? And really going into that detailed level as to, okay, if we know what it is we want to do, then how do we do it? And bringing these lessons together is a great way of doing that. We started off, as I said at the beginning, doing it internationally and trying to understand how it happened internationally. And I think what Andy and Joan have really given us is an insight into how it can be done locally in the UK. So we have 2 other webinars scheduled, 3rd of November and 6th of December, with Cumbria and West Sussex, respectively. And I'm sure that they will be bringing more lessons, more detailed lessons that will really complement what Andy and Joan have been talking around. Again, another shout out for the annual conference. We'll be sharing information on that very, very soon. But I guess I would just like to thank Andy and Joan for their time, for their thoughts, and thanks Andrew for structuring the conversation so well, and to the participants for joining, as well as for your questions and contributions. So thank you very much, everybody. And the video of this will be available on YouTube. We'll circulate it through the NCSR mail lists. But with that, I'll close the webinar and just, my thanks to all involved. Thank you.